China is an enormous country with a very long history, but set against the void of space and depth of time, isn't it just a speck? And what about you, listener? You're even less than a speck, aren't you? And me? I'm just the voice in your ear, driving you, slowly but surely, to the brink of insanity. But it's not all bad. There's another voice with me. It's Dylan Levi King, former guest on the show, who's returning to talk to me about some very interesting translated Chinese fiction. It's fiction from the internet, and it's written in the style of H.P. Lovecraft short stories, and it is The Flock of Ba Hui, so I'm really excited to talk about it. First off, 2 quick disclaimers. In recording the interview, it seems that Zoom was getting the audio from my laptop's mic and not my proper USB mic that I'm using right now, so my voice sounds a bit fuzzy. That's happened quite recently. If it were to happen a third time, I'd just have to quit the show. 3 strikes and you're out. But I don't think it will be happening. I've got myself a nice new laptop, and it seems to be much better at recognizing the microphones and whatnot. But I am going to make extra sure that it doesn't happen again, because it annoys me a lot, and I imagine it probably annoys some of you. So yeah, that's the first disclaimer. Second one is, I do quite a lot of, I'm not going to say talking out my bumhole, I will say shower thoughtification. I do a lot of shower thoughtification in this episode, so if you hear me badly misrepresenting, for example, the history of the Shang dynasty, and I really think that that's the most dubious part of the episode, when I'm kind of thinking aloud about stuff I only half understand. If anything like that jumps out at you and you think you want to have it corrected, or if you just want to feedback and say you didn't quite get this right, or here's something that would be interesting for you to know, you can do it via social media. Links are in the show notes, and I'll plug all the different social media at the end of the show as well. So there's your disclaimers. Now we're going to do the terrific news, the translated Chinese fiction news. So I've got 3 little things. The first is an event I'd like to promote. It's happening 1 p.m. on the 5th of January. If you're listening in the future, hopefully this one should be available to watch on YouTube. Not sure about that though. But anyway, it's called Women Writing China. It's being jointly hosted by the Leeds Centre for New Chinese Writing and by Sinuous Books. And it's got the author Li Juan and the translator of her upcoming book Distant Sunflower Fields, Christopher Payne. And it's going to be focusing on, I think, interview with Li Juan via an interpreter. I guess Christopher Payne's the interpreter, and she's going to be talking about her book and being a woman writing China, whatever that means. So that is coming up. Put it in your diaries. Second piece of news. This is an article I want to plug. I think it's a pretty cool one. It's titled How a Music Streaming Site Became a Safe Space for Leftist Listeners. And this is talking about the Chinese website NetEase. It's a music streaming site. NetEase it's just its English name. When it says leftist listeners, what it means, it's leftist in the Chinese context of like very old school Marxist communist left. So, and a lot of the music, it's not like, I don't know, rebellious rock or rebellious anything. Well, it is rebellious stuff, but it's not modern music. It's like old socialist anthems and stuff. I think this is something that interests me a lot, because as I mentioned when I appeared on the Dickheads podcast about Chinese sci-fi, discussions on the Chinese internet and in the public sphere in general are very, they're heavily censored, but there are certain spectrums in which you're allowed to have an opinion, so to speak, and one of them is like how much of an old school socialist you are or aren't. Although there are certain things that, even if you frame them as like communism, can be or will be taken offline or could get you in trouble. So, thinking of things like workers' uprisings, rebellions, that's not so the CCP don't take so kindly to that, despite, of course, their own heritage or history or background or whatever you want, formation, roots, whatever you want to call it, their own connection with, workers' revolts and stuff. So that's an interesting little article. It's quite short, but who knows, it might be a springboard for you to learn more about this stuff. Now, the last thing is a BBC Radio 3 series, which is available as a podcast on the BBC Sounds website. It's called Peking Noir. It is presented by none other than Paul French, a former guest on the show. I'm just going to read the first 2 sentences, the first 2 paragraphs of its description, because I don't think I could do a better job than these things do. So bear with me a minute. Here we go. Whatever anyone declared categorically about Shura Giraldi, someone else insisted on the exact opposite. Shura was handsome and beautiful. Shura was kind and good. Shura was exploitative and evil. Shura was just another struggling white Russian refugee trying to get by in 1930s China. Shura was the heart and brains of a gang that ran clubs, sex workers, illicit booze and drugs, when not robbing banks and stealing gems to fence in Shanghai. Shura loved ballet and cabaret, creating the Shura Giraldi dance troupe that topped the bill at all the best Peking nightclubs. Shura sometimes presented as male and sometimes as female. When passing as a man, Shura bound his breasts tightly and wore a sharp-tailored suit. When she was a woman, she wore startlingly coloured robes, both Chinese-style cheongsam and Western dresses, letting her raven hair flow loose, said witnesses. Shura had added an incredibly massive layer of confusion and obfuscation to anyone looking by changing gender, switching for anonymity. You know what I'm trying to say. Switching for anonymity. Anonymity? Oh dear. Switching so that you couldn't know who she was, for commercial gain or criminal advantage, for love, for a whim. So it is even cooler than it sounds. I'll say no more than that. But yeah, go check that out. Link to all these things will be in the show notes. Now, enough of only me. Let's have me and the guest, Dylan Levi King. Let's hear the interview about Flock of Ba Hui. So, hello Dylan. Good to have you back on the show. How's it going and what have you been up to?
Hey, it's good to be back. I can't remember how long ago we did the last one, so I think I've been up to quite a lot. I've translated at least a couple books since then. I've got the Cai Chongda memoir that's coming out with HarperCollins and a Mai Jia book as well. So a couple big things. Probably the last time I talked to you too, I was talking about the Jia Pinghua book and still not out yet. So still that to look forward to.
Can you give us an update on where it is, or is that all confidential?
Nah, I don't know if it's confidential or it's just, I don't know, publishing world is kind of slowed down to some extent. Just everything's getting pushed back and back and back. So
understandable, given the circumstances. Yeah, let's keep going. So we're going to talk about Chinese web fiction again. Not that me and you are talking about it again, but it's come up surprisingly often on the show. But most times when we've talked about Chinese web fiction, it's been about something very Chinese. So it's wuxia or some other sort of Chinese fantasy genre. This time we are looking at a book that's somewhere in the fantasy genre fiction world, but its roots aren't really so Chinese. They're more sort of from a Western style. So let's talk about where the book we're talking about emerged from. Which hole did it climb out of?
Sure. We should say what this book is. It's the Flock of Ba Hui. It's got a really interesting story in that it's Lovecraftian. It comes from the Cthulhu mythos, and came from a message board dedicated to role-playing games, which is not usually a source of literature, especially, anything that we see. It's something you usually have to be in the scene to know about. Not something that usually appears through like a press and in translation.
Yeah, and in a press that doesn't do, role-playing games. It's just a normal, what are they? It's Camphor Press, so they do sort of books from China, Taiwan, Asia. Mostly untranslated, I think. Mostly it's stuff by Westerners over there who have been over there writing about it. But this one's from a very different source. It's from, like you said, the Ring of Wonder. If anyone listening wants to go visit, that's trow.cc. And in my research for the show, I had a look, thinking it was going to be a forum of like web fiction, something like Chidian, the Tencent web fiction site. But it's actually, like you said, no, it's a message board for mostly not writing, mostly discussion of
and it's like a
geek culture.
It's really like an old school message board, like the kind that you don't see anymore. Like it's I think it was launched in 2005-ish, but it looks like it could be from like 1998. It's got that pure message board aesthetic.
Yeah, totally. So that's the book and where it came from. The author
goes under the username Ubmab, which makes more sense when you spell it backwards. And we'll talk more about the translators later. You mentioned you mentioned it's a Lovecraftian book, and it's from the Lovecraft mythos. That's probably the main thing we should stress, is that it's not just in a sort of a horror vein of horror, the horror genre that you could describe as Lovecraftian. It's deliberately a homage in the mythos. Maybe some of the listeners know what that means, others don't. So what do we mean when we say the Cthulhu or the Lovecraft mythos?
Yeah, I think that's the best place to start, explaining who Lovecraft is and explaining why anyone would set their works in like his extended universe, or why he has an extended universe. Lovecraft was a sort of horror, fantasy, science fiction writer of the early 20th century. He was basically unknown in his lifetime. He would publish in like small, like Amazing Stories magazines or little horror magazines. And he basically died penniless and unknown, and by all accounts, very unhappy. And he was sort of resurrected at a later date. I mean, there was what's the name of the guy? Derleth is
August Derleth, yeah.
Yeah, he came along, and he had known Lovecraft during his lifetime and respected his work, and basically started collecting it together and cataloging it and collecting all these other people who were writing kind of similar stories and putting them together and forming what was called the Cthulhu mythos, which is like his extended universe, I guess, made sort of united by like his idea of like cosmic horror, and also like the certain deities that he added into that world. What do you think? Is that close to explaining?
Yeah. I mean, I'm hardly an expert, but yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, continuing the themes and bringing none of it. I don't think any of the human characters are continued, because they're not really the point. If there are characters, it's all these entities from the bottom of the earth or from outer space. And I think this will come up later, talking about Flock of Ba Hui, but one of the ideas in cosmic horror is that we're very small, the universe is huge, time is very long, our lives are minutely short, and the universe, Earth or the universe, was around long before humans. It will be around long after we're gone, either as individuals or as a species. And the little fantastical conceit is that there's these much more intelligent or incomprehensible beings that were also there before us and are going to come back one day and take our place and do horrible things to us.
That's like what's special about Lovecraft, and what's the source of the horror, and what makes it so horrible is that it wasn't like imagine a typical horror story. There's a madman coming to stab you, or there's some sort of a monster reanimated back to life. I mean, those things might be in Lovecraft, but he basically tries to instill in the reader that sense that not that the world is against us or that the world is evil, but that we're completely insignificant. The world doesn't care about us. If anything bad happens to us, if any, there's no good or evil. We're just little ants, less than ants, just specks waiting to be crushed by things greater than us. Humanity doesn't matter. Civilization doesn't matter.
So the ant thing probably gives him something in common with Liu Cixin, even though they're writing quite different stuff. And if you're a cynical person, or what is the word for someone who hates humanity? What is that word?
A nihilist?
No, there's a word. Misanthrope. Yeah, if you're a misanthrope, you probably would like this stuff, because it would it would give you some literary foundation for your.
But in a way, it's almost more hopeful than like just being a misanthrope or being a nihilist. It's just like, in a way, it's almost freeing if you take on that as your belief that it's not saying you shouldn't try to build civilization and shouldn't try to do whatever it is you want to do, but it just doesn't matter at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I forget this is explicitly said by Lovecraft anywhere in his letters, or if this is just secondary things I read. There's an author, this was sort of my gateway to learning about Lovecraft, an author called Thomas Ligotti, who is actually a nihilist and by all accounts seems to be a pretty miserable guy. But his sort of one glimmer of light that he gets something out of life is writing about horrible, terrifying things, but have some sort of glimmer of the sublime. And he has a non-fiction book, which is sort of a nihilist manifesto, called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. And everywhere in that where he cites Lovecraft, it's sort of about, ironically, like the love of the craft. It's about this kind of supreme, awful feeling, which, although I'm only really using negative or neutral words to describe it, seems to be some source of something that these guys could latch onto. Like I guess like most people who call themselves a nihilist, it's actually impossible to really be a nihilist. There's always something you sort of get something out of. But
I was thinking.
Sorry, go on.
I got into Lovecraft through William S. Burroughs and hearing his name like connected to those 1980s trilogies he wrote, like The Western Lands, Place of Dead Roads, and all those horrible novels about centipedes killing people, and a lot of homoerotic, horrible, sadistic sex. And I mean, compared to that kind of stuff, I mean, Lovecraft is kind of like cheerful. A walk in the park. Yeah
for sure. The only Burroughs I've read was Naked Lunch, and I was not ready for that. I didn't know what I was getting myself in for. But let's bring things a little bit back to Flock of Ba Hui. Lay a little bit more groundwork. I know you know a little bit about Lovecraft's impact in China and its neighbors in East Asia, because you did a little bit of a blog about that and some other things. And this is something I know nothing about, pretty much. So what can you say about that?
Well, I think we have to take a step back to that point where Derleth starts collecting his stories and what happens after that. So it wasn't really like it wasn't like Lovecraft exploded into literary stardom. He was sort of picked up by like the 60s counterculture guys like Burroughs and sci-fi guys, but the key thing is, perhaps for his fame, was a role-playing game, the Call of Cthulhu, in the early 80s. And that probably introduced more people to Lovecraft than anything else. And that's also how it got into Asia. You know, Japanese role-playing folks got into it. And from there, you get a whole bunch of Lovecraftian fiction and things set in the Cthulhu mythos. And I think Japan is the key to understanding how it jumps into China. I don't think there was no tradition of it, there were no translations of Lovecraft. There's like one from 1948, which might even have been a translation from Japanese. And really, it doesn't pick up again in China until that role-playing game and manga that came from the role-playing game cultural sphere made the jump over to the Chinese internet. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Which story was it that made it over in 1948?
I can't remember. It was.
I think did you name it in your blog?
Yeah, I named it. Was the music of Eric Zan or something like that?
Right. Which that was right.
Yeah, me neither. I didn't know it at all either. There was a Japanese Edogawa Rampo. He's like the Conan Doyle of Japan. He was sort of like a Lovecraft head in like the post-war 40s, and he sort of introduced that sort of. That's how he sort of introduced it. There were a lot of translations. There were like a ton of pulp magazines and cheap paperbacks in Japan in the post-war period, and Lovecraft was very popular there. So like as early as, even before the board game, if I can take a step back again, even before the board game arrived in the 80s, there was like a small community of like Lovecraft people, and actually people writing in the Lovecraft, in the Cthulhu mythos in like the 60s and 70s, even before the board game. But the board game is really key to understanding everything here, I think, and how it gets into like nerd culture in general.
For sure, yeah. If one just does some quite basic googling about people Lovecraft today on the English language internet, I'm sure in more than one or two places you can see there would be some kind of mention that loads and loads of people in the English or Western English speaking world or Western world who know Lovecraft might know vaguely that it stems from a guy who wrote stuff, or they might not know at all. But what they will know it from is either the board game or the board game's offspring, be it like movies or comic books or even like little woolly knitted Cthulhu octopuses.
Yeah, like I knew there was something called Cthulhu, and he was like an octopus man,
Right.
way before I ever heard about Lovecraft.
Yeah, same. Right. So that's probably all we can say. I did just remember, I learned by listening to the Spectology podcast, who are one of the other podcasts who've interviewed Chinese sci-fi author Shen Fan. He mentioned to them that he really likes Lovecraft. I don't know if he enjoys other weird fiction or stuff, but should he ever come back on, I really want to ask him about that, because it's all very well for us to be scratching our heads wondering where this thing jumped across the sea from Japan to China, but someone like Stan Fan might be able to give us more of an inside picture, so to speak. But let's keep moving on. We mentioned a little bit about how the stories themselves are from this website, Ring of Wonder, but we haven't talked about how the translators found it and how we eventually have an English language book we can buy and read today. I just reread the translators' intros. There's two translators. The story kind of is like a stepping stone from the original text to one translator to the next, then to the publisher. I could lay it out, or you could do that.
You lay it out, because you just reread the introductions. I reread them a couple days ago, but they're probably fresh in your mind right now.
Sure, right, yeah. If I miss anything, just jump in.
Sure.
So we start with the story on the Ring of Wonder, and this guy who identifies himself only by his internet username, Akira, finds the story. Both these translators are expats who lived in China. One of them, I don't know if he's still there, but this guy Akira, he mentions that he's left, presumably gone back to wherever he came from. So Akira, this guy, had become interested in Lovecraft in 2013 and was also, I think, learning Chinese at the same time. So decided to have a shot at translating this one Lovecraftian story off of Ring of Wonder called The Flock of Ba Hui, because we should mention there's 4 stories, or arguably 5, we'll get into that, 4 or 5 stories in the book, and The Flock of Ba Hui, the titular one, is the first story proper in the book. So anyway, he had a go at translating it, found it was much harder than he expected, got so far, then as a way of motivating himself, decided to, I don't know, publicize what he was doing online. I don't think he said if he was tweeting about it or who knows what. But
yeah, he was tweeting and posting about it before, because I do remember mention of it before the book came out.
All right. Okay. So he tweeted about it then, and that got the attention of another, what can we say, online / literary persona. This guy, Arthur, and my French pronunciation is terrible, Mersault.
I like Mersault.
Arthur Mersault found him.
Yeah.
Found him, and this guy was a previously published author. He'd written a book called Party Members, kind of a dark, I was going to say edgy, maybe edgy or edgelord, pick your word, sort of black comedy about, I don't know, party members in some Chinese city.
Yeah, it was like a super intense satire of China. Yeah.
Right. I can only imagine. But that was published by this same publisher, Camphor Press. And I guess Arthur Mersault also is able to translate Chinese. So he kind of took up the baton, finished off The Flock of Ba Hui, translated 3 other stories by this author that were on Ring of Wonder. And then he gave it back to Akira for a final pass. So maybe tidying up the English rather than translating. I'm not sure. I would assume that's what he was doing. And I guess the book then got accepted by Camphor Press, who previously published Party Members. And now we have it. Although the translators played a little bit of a game, a literary game, with how they presented the stories. I guess we could talk about that, unless there's anything I don't think I missed anything. But
No, I mean, I would say Arthur Marceau, his book Party Members is, when you read it, you think, if you've read it, you think he would be the perfect person to translate this kind of stuff, because it's just full of purple prose and just like everything amped up. I mean, it's like something out of a pulp magazine. He'd be absolutely perfect for this, and I think that turns out to be true. But yeah, they took the stories in here and added an additional like framing story where four people, a researcher, a dreamer, an anthropologist, and a historian, have been invited to a remote Himalayan farmhouse to have these stories recounted to them. If I'm not mistaken, if I'm not misremembering it.
that's what we're led to believe at the opening. But there's some twists there's a quite good twist actually in this framing device story. Have you read or heard of a Lovecraft story called The Whisperer in Dark?
I don't think so.
Right. Well, I won't spoil exactly how, but the framing story ends up referencing that one. So just like some of the Chinese stories, there's I don't know, there's all these different words: pastiche, parody, homage. Pick whichever one, but it's intertextualizing with some other older actual Lovecraft story.
I feel like I should have said, like, right at the start that I'm not a lover of Lovecraft. I'm not the biggest Lovecraft fan. It's really not my type of thing, but I've read quite a bit, and I think this book would be maybe 10 times better if you could pick up all the buried Lovecraft references, both in the framing story and in the stories they've translated, the Ubmab stories. So I feel like I'm missing out a little bit on that.
Yeah, although if you think about it, that's quite different from a lot of other translated Chinese fiction, where the translator either has to leave a footnote. The reference would be to something, whether or not it's translated, your average Western reader maybe won't have heard of. And often it's referencing stuff which you can't even read in English in the first place. So the translator's got to decide whether to foreignize the thing, footnote it, or just kind of leave it and the reference is lost.
There's some good examples of that in here, like of both like Chinese books that most people have never read with a footnote, and also things that, are Lovecraft references.
Which are, unless you really randomly picked up the book, it's a common thing between you and the author.
Yeah.
Something that, despite all your cultural differences and whatever, you both would know at least a little bit about. Yeah, myself, I've not read a massive amount of Lovecraft stories, just mostly some of the more famous ones. But that Whisperer in Darkness story, it was a nice surprise to find out that the framing was based on that story, because that's probably my favorite Lovecraft story out of all the ones I've read. It's really quite good. It's got it takes the two things I like the most, which are the atmosphere, creating a freaky otherworldly atmosphere and a sense of dread, and tying in some kind of bigger cosmic horror. And there's monsters. It helps when there's monsters. Concretizes things a bit. So yeah, that's us kind of summarized the framing device. Maybe we could summarize the stories too. Now, I think we agreed you were good doing describing all but one of them, and I'll try and describe the sort of odd one out of the four.
Sure. Let's start with the main one. The titular story is the Flock of Ba Hui, which is like pretty much, if you've read Lovecraft, you've probably read some variation on this story. You've got an archaeologist who has gone missing. He's gone hunting for some references to some extinct kingdom, perhaps some serpent god called Ba Hui. And he comes back to his house with some pottery shards that he's found on his expeditions, and they give off a fishy smell. Another great Lovecraft thing. Everybody's always giving off fishy smells.
Yeah, the huge racist, and he hated seafood, and it's hard to know which one he hated more.
And the translation is a great. It's called a noisome ichthyoid scent. Well, just wonderful. And so, anyways, this archaeologist is driven mad. He ends up burning down his house. He torches all of his notes. He's confined by I believe it's his wife, to a mental institution. And then our narrator is is forced to go assembling the pieces of the puzzle. He retraces the steps of this mad archaeologist. He locates the place that the pottery shards came from. He descends into a strange cave where there's murals on the wall depicting all manner of revolting acts, from human sacrifice to cannibalism. He sees skeletons of a unknown species, perhaps some sort of a reptile. He gets deeper and deeper into the cave, and finally the serpent god, or whoever the hell it is, appears. He manages to escape, or he finds himself outside of the cave, and they go back to the archaeologist's notebook and find his final words, that he has become a child of Ba Hui, as perhaps they themselves have too. Perfect Lovecraft story, beautifully done here, beautifully translated as well.
Yeah, we can talk a bit more about the prose later, but yeah, I agree. For the most part, the strapping together of various slightly obscure adjectives and adverbs is pretty well done.
Yeah.
So that's that one. Is
what's
the next one
Ancient
my one?
Tower? Or do you want to do Nadir?
Nadir was Nadir. Nadir was the second story, wasn't it? So I'm doing this one, or I'm going to describe it as well as I can remember it. It's a bit of an odd one out because it doesn't have a Chinese setting or a setting within the People's Republic of China. It doesn't even really have a real world setting. It's in some sort of abstract, not in a fancy land that you couldn't pin it on like which particular region of the world it's based on. Although my feeling was it had a generally sort of Western or European or whatever feel. I think in the intro, the translators mentioned that the story references so and so different settings from the Cthulhu mythos or the Lovecraft mythos, but I didn't know what they were. So unless you're really up on your Lovecraft, it might just read like a generic fantasy setting, which reminded me when the translator Deathblade was running me through the different online Chinese fantasy genres. There's one which I've never looked at called Xuan Huan, which is kind of West. It's got a more kind of. It doesn't have any strictly Chinese elements. It tends to be fantasy worlds or Western influenced fantasy worlds. So I wondered if there were some Xuan Huan influences in Nadir. Maybe not.
I think like the Lovecrafting is usually divided into like the Cthulhu mythos and then Arkham or Lovecraft Country, which is like the New England setting, and then like the Dunsany stories, the ones who are influenced by this Lord Dunsany, which are like all these fantasy settings. There's like a whole body of these like Lovecraft stories that are set in like, you can't really tell if it's like Europe of like the Dark Ages or later. It's sort of hard to pin down.
Yeah, I think actually now you mentioned it, the translator's intro said something about the dream cycle. But yeah, sort of they've got a more sort of romantic, I guess romantic in the literary sense, like big feelings, huge landscapes, kind of dreamy, blah blah. So this guy, he's on a search for truth and beauty or something. He finds a big dark tower. He begins to climb it. It seems to go on and on forever. I think at some points he's climbing through pitch darkness. Things reach huge extremes. I think he almost starves on the way up because he's been climbing so long. He finally gets to the top and he sees sort of a celestial heavens, which appears to be very beautiful, but then awful things start to happen. The stars start moving in ways they shouldn't. And it becomes very sort of, I guess, like pure cosmic horror because there's no monsters. He's just seeing the stars in the universe revealing themselves to be evil or malicious, or at least, if, like we were saying, even if they're not actively malicious, they're incomprehensible and they don't give a shit about you, and they're probably not very good for your, their being in their proximity won't be good for your brain or your body. So I think he's driven mad or whatever. He's cast out of the tower and he finds himself in a world that's his own but not quite his own. So I think, Dylan, you said you didn't really like that one. I liked it quite a bit, and it felt like although it was second out of 4, it sticks better in my mind in some ways because it stands out. Whereas I think story 1 and 4 are a little bit samey. Story 3 is quite interesting, though it's quite different in a way.
I think
It's
it's
a
just like
Black Tasway.
I think it's just like a personal taste. You know, I like realism, and
Right.
any when we completely depart from realism, it gets a bit tough for me. I mean, it's kind of
Sure.
tough as somebody who loves realism to be into Lovecraft, and that's part of why I'm not a huge Lovecraft fan. But that is getting a little bit too far off track for me. I need a couple of real life locations to anchor me to the world.
Yeah, and it's like if it was a longer novel or novella length story, he'd have to do some world building. If it was a flash fiction, really short, then probably no problem. But it's at that sort of several thousand words length where if you're looking for something to hold on to, you just won't really get it. You just have to kind of roll with the magic.
See, that's why my favorite was if not the Flock of Ba Hui, then Black Taisui. I mean,
Mm,
I'll just skip quickly over the Ancient Tower, which is kind of a similar thing. I mean, it's somebody goes into a stupa out on they hear a strange sound emitted from a from a stupa out on the plateau and descend inside or ascend inside and see horrible things.
mm,
Black Taisui is a little bit more meaty and tends to appeal
mm,
to my taste a bit more. Again, we have an archaeologist. He's appears at the start of the story as a decomposed corpse. His papers and his belongings get donated to the Provincial Archaeology Institute, and what those papers narrate is a family history, a very strange family history about his great grandfather who was living along the Qingdao River, and he was suspected by the German authorities of smuggling something because he was always going out on his boat at strange times in the middle of the night. But he was involved in occult activities. He formed a cult called the School of Longevity. He kept expanding his holdings along the river until he had built a sort of compound for himself, and he began tunneling into the ground. People in the nearby area heard mysterious sounds, perhaps the call of Cthulhu coming from there. So, anyways, the archaeologist who appears first as a decomposed corpse at the start of the story, he ends up tracking down his great grandfather. He buys that property. He finds a strange trap door. Look out. He goes down inside. He starts writing these notes about what he sees there. He finds a manuscript describing these strange monsters and immortality, things that his ancestors, his great grandfather, would have described, would have seen, would have been in contact with. And our narrator, who's working at the Archaeology Institute, goes to that compound and descends into the trap door and finds exactly what Lao Ming Chang found that left him a decomposed corpse. Another typically Lovecraftian protagonist and setting and everything.
yeah, and it gets weirder and weirder as it goes on as well, which is a nice touch. Whereas like I suppose the other three stories do get weirder and weirder, but that's in a more direct way because the protagonist is going either deeper down a tunnel or higher up a tower. So it's not so much in the plotting and the atmosphere that things get weirder, but it's more literal. Whereas yeah, like I think you're right in saying it's Black Tidesway is a bit more meaty or fleshy because there is a sort of there's I guess that's one of the sources of horror in Lovecraft or Lovecraftian stories is fleshiness of some of the monsters that are described. They might some of them are so otherworldly that you wouldn't necessarily even think of them as having flesh, but other ones are described as being like leathery or fishy or slimy or slippy. And that's there's a passage you sent me on Twitter from Black Tidesway that you really liked. And maybe we could read that actually, so the
Sure.
listeners know what.
I've got it up right now.
Hey.
I was dying to read it. Let
Perfect.
me. The officer saw inordinate multitudes of grotesque, glistening arms, claws, tentacles, and other unknown limbs stretching from and plunging into that hellish pile. Innumerable grimacing wounds cracking open and sealing shut like mouths, and legions of viridian eyes forming like pustules, melting and popping across the ceaseless, undulating of the creature's surface, far more than a blasphemous imitation of nature. In the lapses between spewing protoplasmic organs, all of the arms, claws, and tentacles twisted and twirled through the fetid air, desperately grasping anything nearby. The mouth-like fissures screamed broken gibberish in an indistinguishable cacophony, while the temporary eyes rolled in the direction of the light source, glaring, unblinking, seeing. Amid the pandemonium, the infernal mass began to roll toward them like hot tar, swelling and trembling, eddying, pulsating. How about that?
It's something. It's
Yeah.
it's all in, playing all the cards. There's a few other things that I'll mention now in the summary, so we can bring them up later. Yeah, I think they're worth mentioning. So the Flock of Ba Hui, where we go into the tunnel and meet the snake god sort of guy, that is set in an area of, I think, southern Sichuan, at least a mountainous area of Sichuan, where the population are an ethnic, one of China's minorities, one of their Minzu. It's the Yi, who are they're real people. And one of the things that our narrator finds is evidence of a sort of lost kingdom, where there's like a very sort of like world mythology sort of founding myth that they're able to work out in slightly what's the word? They're able to work out just from cave paintings a very detailed origin story of the people, which sort of stretches your belief, but whatever. It's web fiction. So there's an origin story of these, I think, 7 brothers who are fleeing, trying to find a new kingdom. They make a sort of a Faustian deal with the mountain god, who transforms them into hideous shapes. And then we learn, or the archaeologist or whatever pieces together, that there was this ancient kingdom that sort of bullied the neighboring kingdoms in this region of what today is modern China. So there's that. The only thing I'd say about Black Tai Sui that might be worth mentioning later is that the cult found this black substance called Black Tai Sui way out in the sea to the east, and they link it back to journeys that are documented way back in Chinese history, where people were trying to go east and find the land of the immortals. So the author Ubmab's tied Lovecraftian stuff into more ancient Chinese stuff in an interesting way. I think that bears mentioning. And in the ancient tower, we're in Tibet. So the narrator is going into an area which is home to Tibetans. And he goes into a stupa, a Buddhist stupa, so a Tibetan Buddhist stupa. And then he finds, when he finds something awful way down below, he sees there are Tibetan people sort of involved, either willingly or unwillingly. It's not totally clear, but they seem to be wrapped up in the horrible goings on. And when I think this is worth bearing in mind when we get on to talk about Lovecraft the racist and the racism that's in the old Lovecraft stories, and whether or not we see them in these ones, or whether we see something that could be compared. How well do you think the stories emulate Lovecraft? I mean, we read that passage, and certainly they translate, well, Ubmab and the translators have produced something with amazing, fantastical descriptions. Otherwise, how well do you think the stories work as homages to Lovecraft, or being part of the mythos?
I think they're absolutely excellent. It's clear that that Ubmab, I mean, he's also translated Lovecraft and some other stories from the Cthulhu mythos. He clearly knows them very well, and he pulls it off basically perfectly. I mean, and the translators match the language, I think, as close as you can get. I think it's quite perfect.
My feeling was, in terms of the style, it was really there. I didn't always get the sense of cosmic horror some of the really good Lovecraft stories gave me. But then again, not every Lovecraft story I read gave me a sense of dread or horror either. But I'm thinking of the one I mentioned, Whisper in Darkness, which has a slow burn, has monsters, has cosmic horror. Whereas I felt some of the stories ticked 1 or 2 boxes. Not sure if any of them ticked all of them, but I'm just nitpicking. I think in general, they're a really interesting homage, but they're also recognizably Chinese, which is pretty cool. Which kind of, sorry, you're going to say something, or?
No. I think maybe I don't know. I wonder if I wonder if there's some sort of cultural affinities that we might have, or cultural feelings we might have, that would, like reading of the Shadow over Innsmouth. There's something that is more something that can be connected to more immediately
Right.
than like descending into a stupa. You know what I mean? Like
Sure, yeah.
it's like my girlfriend is horribly afraid of shrines at night. There's so
These
many
Japanese
shrines.
shrines, right?
Yeah, Shinto shrines dotted around Tokyo. They Walking through a shrine yard at night wouldn't cause me any concern, but it would cause her to look twice, because there's so many stories about bad things happening in shrine yards, or like
Right.
cemeteries. For me, I wouldn't cut through a cemetery
Mm.
at midnight. I wonder if that's sort of kind of a factor here.
Yes. Settings are interesting, because I mean, one thing I do know about original Lovecraft stories is, yeah, you have some set in his sort of New England sort of world, but he has other stories which are set in very far-flung places. So one of the other ones, which is one of his better liked ones, probably one of my favorite ones I've read, The Mountains of Madness, which is set somewhere in a crazy formation of mountains in Antarctica. And I'm thinking of other what. There's one, I don't remember what it was called, but it's a lot like Flock of Ba Hui and the Ancient Tower. It's about a guy descending beneath a pyramid or a desert, a lost city in the maybe it's a lost city in the desert, but he's clearly not. He's in somewhere very far away that H.P. Lovecraft himself never would have been to.
Maybe the Nameless City.
The
Could
Nameless
it be?
City. Yeah. So this is one thing Lovecraft did. He would use settings, kind of like exotic in quote marked settings of fantastic places, which he himself never visited and possibly never would have wanted to. He just knew about them from books. He, despite being, I think he's described as being both kind of from another time, born in the wrong generation sort of guy, but also he's described as being kind of, I don't know how, who knows what this means, but being more sort of European than he was American, or pining for the old world in some way, but he never went. So yeah, my point was, yeah, setting is an interesting thing, because maybe there's something we'd get from us, yeah, like Shadow over Innsmouth, where it's a very particular sort of old Western town versus one in a setting he's basically made up, like mountains under Antarctica. And yeah, in this book, we have one fantasy setting where we're probably on equal footing, more or less, with the Chinese reader. And then we have South Sichuan, where us too, wouldn't be on an equal footing with some random Lovecraft fan who didn't really know, couldn't
Right.
find Sichuan on a map, or would maybe assume that the Yi ethnicity people are just the author's creation. And maybe a generic Western reader reading a story set in Tibet would come in with slightly more loaded expectations than we do.
And it's interesting. I wonder,
Mm-hmm.
like how like that Orientalist horror of like the Nameless City, where he's out in the desert and he finds a strange temple. That's sort of strikes horror into white Anglos, like the idea of like this Eastern horrible place. I wonder if that's sort of an influence with choosing these places, like a Tibetan stupa, or like definitely not Chinese places, distinctly not Chinese places, except for Black Tai
That's it.
Sui. It's Tibet, and it's those sort of things. I wonder how much that's influenced by like the Orientalist horror that you find in Western horror, and Lovecraft in particular.
I'm going to skip to our question, or kind of in a roundabout way, skip ahead slightly to where I was planning to talk about, yeah, like ethnicity and race and all this stuff. Because what we've not said, although it's there by implication, is that all our narrators seem to be Han Chinese, and in 2 of the 4 stories, they're going to non-Han places, or it wouldn't be too much of a stray to say they're going to places which are not Chinese, but which are inside modern China. And certainly through most of history and time, have not been Han. And this is an interesting thing. I think when you look at more recent discussion about Lovecraft, there's this idea of deep time that people try and bring into him, which I think is a term that has become more popular around, I don't know, the last 10 years or something. But the idea of there's time that we can measure in our history, like medieval periods, classical periods, even prehistoric man. But then when you go really far back, there's deep time, which we can't, thinking in numbers won't really help us. Like all you have to do is watch BBC Walking with Dinosaurs or something and try and take seriously the numbers that you're showing, numbers of hundreds of millions of years that these things existed. And your brain starts to go in a sort of down a Lovecraftian path where you think about how infinitesimal you are. Yeah, when you think about the Han Chinese people, I believe they started off in a pretty small corner of what today is modern China. And the landscapes which are today part of modern China are really diverse. I went into this train of thought without a clear endpoint in mind. But suffice to say, if you were trying to mine the non-Han areas for some horror, going down into the earth, into time, so to speak, finding stuff from the deep, deep past, long before records were made, doesn't seem like a bad strategy. And I think Ubmab's done it in a way that's not nasty towards the Yi or the Tibetan people, whereas some of Lovecraft's stories, not all of them, but he does, I think in Cthulhu, for example, he writes some pretty just nasty things about black people, the black people of the world or whatever. Whereas like if you were looking for something mean about the Yi or the Tibetans, you'd kind of have to be analyzing it or reading between the lines or seeing stuff that's not really there.
Well, I mean, poor Lovecraft had to meet Italians and Irish and black people, but probably Ubmab has never had to come into contact with Tibetans or Yi, perhaps.
Probably not.
I mean,
yeah.
But yeah, like if you were, a big part of Lovecraft is that horror at racial difference and racial mixing. So if you were Chinese, the first thing you would go to would not be immigrants. There's no Irish immigrants coming over munching on potatoes. It would be Tibetans and those sort of quote unquote primitive cultures on the margins of the Han Empire. That's where you would go to get that Orientalist horror.
I don't know if there's much more I can say. Just there was a thing that I really found interesting in the story was like the bit I mentioned in Flock of Ba Hui, where we're learning that there was this not just a cult or a people, but the Ba Hui seemed to have like a kingdom that was ransacking the nearby kingdoms. So you have this, it's not said outright in the text, but if you put it together, it's saying that there were plenty of different kingdoms or states in a land which now, if you say it's not Chinese in front of a nationalistic Chinese person, they won't give you a punch in the face, but they will not be happy with you. But it would be, what am I trying to say? You'd have to be very deluded to think that this land had always been part of the glorious Chinese nation or empire or what have you. And I think the story kind of tugs that string a little without yanking it.
I was going to say it's interesting that a lot of the Japanese Cthulhu mythos stories and Lovecraftian horror goes to China as a source of of Oriental strangeness. There's this writer called Asamatsu Ken, and he wrote about this Shang Dynasty mummy that shows up at a museum or some sort of archaeology institute, which turns out to have reptilian DNA. It's in that case, China is always the source of it. So it kind of makes sense that the Chinese would look for just on the margins of their empire.
There was a book I read recently. It was not a really hardcore history book, but it was a history book about the Mongol Empire from Genghis Khan through to, I guess, the very last vestiges of what had been the Mongol Empire. So the early stuff is quite interesting because it's talking about not just the Mongols, but all their neighbors and their early conquests, whilst there's still enough to fit in one chapter before they had neighbors spanning most of the world. And it talks a little bit about, I think it's the kingdom of Western Xia, who were, we don't really know how Chinese or not they were, because there's very few relics of what they were, but they were sort of, they were west of the Han Empire. They were rival to the Han Empire. And it was not the Han Chinese that destroyed them, I believe. It was the Mongols. And like, it's sort of as far as I'm aware, it's like a big historical question mark. Like, is that a really distinct culture which is just gone? And who knows, is maybe buried under the earth now? It's an interesting thought. I think I'm forgetting. Yeah, you mentioned the Shang. I was thinking of them because just this is based on like one or two books I've read and a lot of faffing about in Wikipedia. The Shang dynasty is a very interesting one too, to me, because if I understand correctly, they had a rival who surpassed them. Was it the Qin or
I don't know.
no? No, I'm embarrassing myself. Who was it that replaced them?
No, you're not embarrassing yourself because I have no idea.
Oh, right.
This
Okay.
history is just completely. I know very little about the Shang dynasty.
Well,
So
I
you're
know.
impressing me by
Right.
saying that there was a rival. Yeah.
Please, listeners, get in touch and berate me for misrepresenting history. But I believe they're from so far back in the past that only a few things exist. I think the Shang bone or Oracle bone scripts are one, but I think it's an interesting thing where it's like how much are they a sort of an ancestor of modern China, and how much are they just a culture that's gone buried under the earth?
Have you ever heard of the mud floods?
No.
Okay, there's this theory proposed by various people that basically in Europe that the Renaissance was immediately preceded by like the golden age of Greek and Roman culture, that there was no dark ages. Like Galkovsky talks about this too. He's a Russian writer, where there was nothing. Everything was fake. There was just a fake history constructed
Is
between.
this
This is high level stuff. This is high level
mm,
stuff. All right, I'm red pilling you here
oh no.
on the mud floods and Galkovsky.
Wait,
That there
okay,
was like
can I stop you? When you said some people, who are some people?
well, let's say Galkovsky, but it's mostly an internet like flat Earth
Okay, right.
caliber
Okay.
theory that basically everything was covered over in mud, and basically the Dark Ages didn't exist. I mean, this is cut this out of the whole the whole thing, but it came to mind there.
No. I think a lot of these conspiracy theories, there's some kind of interesting nugget of not maybe not truth, but there's an interesting thread there because as far as I understand it, some modern historians do say that the what's thought to be the dark, horrible dark time in European history did have some nice things that were gestating, or there was reasonable amount of written culture, and that calling it the Dark Ages is too dismissive. But yeah,
Right.
then leaping to the idea that everything got buried under mud and retcon.
Yes. Yeah.
If you've not got critical thinking skills, you might go down that path.
Yes. If you can bring up your Shang theories, I can bring up my mud floods and Galkovsky. So let's keep going here.
No, yeah, I think the full stop I put on that is even if you accept that your crazy shower thoughts and theories are nonsense, as fiction, they can be really interesting.
Sure.
Like I'm sure this is something a lot of Lovecraftian fans would agree with, that your little strange fantasies about the hidden realities and stuff. Okay, they might have no use value, but if they entertain you, if they hold some sort of sublime power over you, then why not indulge yourself a bit without letting it? Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, yes, hell yeah. I don't think there's much more we can say about the sort of dubious or not orientalizing in the stories without repeating ourselves. But we could take this a little bit further if we look at the literary / online personae of the translators, because I think it's not quite an accident. Well, they've said they were Lovecraft fans, but there might be more to tease out here. And I think their persona is really worth mentioning because they've each given themselves an intro to the book, and they've added their own creative writing. Some translators might say that is not what a translator does. Don't do that. But I would say it's quite good creative writing, and it blends something to the stories. So I'm not saying it's bad that they've inserted themselves, but it might be worth talking about who they are, why they've connected with the text. Do you have anything you could say about that?
I think you have to with something like this that's sort of plucked from a role-playing game message board. It's a very different story than translating somebody who has an agent and wants to be. It's clearly more showing more intention on the part of the translators in curating this kind of thing. And it's an interesting question is why they're curating this in particular. Why are these two gentlemen so interested in this? And I don't think there's any. I don't think they try to cover up exactly why they're interested in it, or at least we can get a good idea. You know, Akira in his introduction mentions his interest in neo-reaction, and Arthur Merceau, I mean, we can gather from his writings what sort of stuff he's interested in too.
Yeah.
You know, and we sort of, that's sort of an interesting question is what, since they're sort of somewhat explicit about their own politics or
their
philosophy.
leanings.
What's going on? Why have they chosen this? And you know, there's with like neo-reactionary philosophy or politics or whatever, Lovecraft sort of looms large. You know, Curtis Yarvin, he came up with the, you know, he always uses Cthulhu always swims left. I mean,
maybe we should pause and rewind. What's neo-reaction? Who's Curtis Yarvin? Let's not bamboozle the listeners.
Yeah, let's not. But what is neo-reaction? I mean, it's sort of what is neo-reaction? Sort of, let's talk about like Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin. Nick Land, I know you're familiar with him, but sort of a accelerationist, somebody who's interested in post-humanism.
Mm-hmm.
Curtis Yarvin is sort of a slightly different figure, but also interested in what comes next, what comes after the civilization that we have right now. Basically, I think what unites them is an interest in the post-human. And I think that is also likely what is what's so appealing about Lovecraft, in that he writes fiction that's, I would say, anti-humanist. There's no humanism in what he writes. There's no belief that we can create something better, or that it will have any meaning if we do so.
Right.
That the future should be something beyond our own little insignificant ant-like existence.
Sure.
Is that somewhat satisfying as an answer?
We should mention where these guys sit on a left-right political spectrum, as well as the fact that they're extremely pessimistic about humans. So Nick Land is a guy I've not read anything by him, but I know him by way of the writer Mark Fisher, who was also interested in the future, but was your fairly generic British academic, a Marxist sort of worldview. And he and Nick were, I don't know if pals is the right word, but they were in the same sort of scene together in the 90s. And it was a sort of a discussing or criticizing the capitalism of the 90s. And they had a real interest in whatever the word cybernetics means. I mean, I think that word is...
I think it's like listening to house music and posting on the internet.
That's the one. Yeah, the 90s internet. Yeah, and I guess either Nick... I think that the thing everyone types into Google is what happened to Nick Land, because as he got older, he moved off to Taiwan and then Shanghai and became a really hardcore reactionary and racist, basically. I don't know whether that came before or after the move to Asia, but that's where he's at now. You can look at him tweeting racist boomer stuff on his Twitter account these days. And Curtis Yarvin, as well as being interested in the future, what is it? He wants like a corporate monarchy or something, or at least that's what he first wrote about.
Neo-cameralism, but I could not explain that. But I mean, they're sort of different figures. Nick Land has had some interesting thoughts, but if you read what Nick Land wrote in like the 90s and then you see what he is now, it's like, what happened to this guy? This guy was seemingly brilliant, and now he's on Twitter like posting like things that like my uncle gets forwarded to him. Like it's quite sad.
But I can see that he's still interested in time and the future, even if, like you said, there's more drivel there now.
Listen, but as somebody who's interested in time in the future, he's sure concerned about like
culture wars.
Yeah, about culture war stuff. I mean, it's quite dull, but I think there's like a sort of a wing of neo-reaction that comes sort of out of the writing of those two men who, you know, Yarvin himself is not particularly racist. I mean, he's as he said famously, he's not allergic to the stuff. I mean, these are not people who would be too precious about like expressing their admiration for fascist regimes of the past or the present. But I don't think that's what they don't think that's what they get out of Lovecraft. I don't think they love Lovecraft for his racism, but more for his just complete rejection of like humanity and modernity in general, I think.
Right, yeah, born in the wrong generation again. Although maybe for these guys, the wrong generation is they want to be further ahead in their particular vision of the future. Yeah, I was having shower thoughts about this because we've talked about these things a wee bit before, and it's such, you could get in such a mire talking about this stuff, and you could go in the opposite direction. I could just caveat myself a million times and talk about nothing, but I'd rather say something. So the thing that occurred to me is I'm quite a pessimistic guy myself. I'm very, very worried about the future. And I don't hate humankind, but I don't think we're particularly, I think we think a bit too much of ourselves. And it's kind of sad that if I'm looking for something in the intellectual political world, that's the guys who have the monopoly on pessimism. Ligotti, in that book, Conspiracy Against the Human Race, he says this much. He says something like only 1% of, or less than 1% of the human population are real pessimists, because nobody else wants to hear it. If you really take serious the idea that like we are fucking useless and we should all be turned into robots, or we shouldn't make babies and we should let ourselves fade out, unsurprisingly, people don't want to hear it. But especially in the sort of my sort of, if you want to put me somewhere on the political spectrum, somewhere on the left, people want to moan about whoever's in power, but no one wants to hear someone say like everything is hopeless, the world's crap. And yeah, these guys, these neo-reaction guys, that seems to be sort of their wheelhouse. Maybe just because they feel really alienated. Maybe they really believe it. But it's kind of a shame that they've monopolized pessimism.
I think that's what I react to in Lovecraft that I don't really like. There's that, I think Welbeck in his book about Lovecraft summed it up the best. I mean, he's sort of like on the same wavelength. He says the character of Lovecraft fascinates us partly because his system of values is entirely opposed to ours. Fundamentally racist, openly reactionary, he glorifies Puritan inhibition and quite evidently finds repellent any open display of eroticism. Resolutely anti-commercial, he despises money, considers democracy to be pure folly, progress an illusion. The word liberty, so dear to Americans, elicits from him only a gloomy sneer. That's I think what I find so I'm quite the opposite of you, that I'm generally an optimist.
Happy guy.
Yeah, the absolutely happy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think that's what I react to in Lovecraft that I don't like, and I think that's what people who are interested in like posthumanism are so enamored of, that he sums it up so well of what they're thinking.
Right. Okay. Probably any further discussion in this area, we'd probably just be repeating ourselves. I imagine some listeners might have some thoughts. I'd love to hear them. The social media, that's what that's for. Let's march on. So we've talked about how fucked Lovecraft's worldview was, but and a lot of that is in his letters rather than in his writing. It's some of it's there in his writing, but the thing, I think the reason people are still interested in talking about him, aside from people on the lunatic fringes of the internet, the reason he's still talked about in mainstream, or is maybe still right now having his resurgence in mainstream discussion of his writing, is that he's a master stylist. He doesn't, he's not just writing monster stories. He's got a very distinctive style. Like we were saying, for some people it's purple prose, for other people it's amazing sentence construction. Never mind atmosphere, but his ability to like build the tower of bricks before it falls over, before the sentence gets too ornate and crazy and loses its effect. He seems to have a mastery of just taking it to as far as it can. We've said already that it seems like in Ba Hui that's been pulled off. I guess Ubmab, have you read any of Ubmab's original Chinese? Because the translators mentioned it a bit.
I actually pulled it up yesterday because I thought you might ask me if I've read anything, and I read the original Flock of Ba Hui story in Chinese as well.
This is something I know nothing about, like Chinese syntax, because all the Chinese I learned was spoken, so very simple sentences. So there's nothing I can say. What can you say?
The thing is, like, Chinese is very, basically modern Chinese literature is very given to descending into purple prose. It's something that a lot of translators will excise, snip out of the writing, because there's so many writers. Basically, every modern writer will descend into it. It's a perfect language for that, and there's a lot of that in the stories by Umab, and the translators do a perfect job of not imitating the Chinese purple prose, but sort of getting the sentiment, the vibe of how it would be. It's absolutely, I think it's quite a really great job that they did in translating purple prose from one extreme in Chinese to the extreme in English.
It's always interesting to me when I read a translator who's espousing their thoughts on how you should translate a language, especially Chinese to English, because there's such a jump there. And the stuff that I think seems the most sensible to me, or rings the most true to me, are the translators who say you should replicate the effect. That's the most important thing. And yes, it seems like that's kind of what you've described. The translators have put something together that is, it's not just a good recreation of Lovecraft, it's also not been pulled out of the thin air. It's there.
Yeah, in a way, I think they've done what every translator should be trying to do, but most don't do. I always rail against academics are the only people translating Chinese literature, which is true. They tend to take a very academic approach, that it should be somewhat transparent and should kind of maintain something of what's underneath. Whereas I don't think the two translators here have really attempted to do that. And in sort of somewhat abandoning that, they've created something that's amazing to read. That's incredibly enjoyable and preserves the sentiment and the mood and the language, the tone, let's say, of the original.
Sure. This is a slightly random thing, but I've been wanting to say this to someone for a while. So speaking of mythoses and extended universes and translators who go a bit above and beyond, I noticed a thing in two books translated by Nicky Harman recently. One was Happy Dreams, the Japinwa book, and the other, I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure it was Book of Sins by Chen Chihuo. But I may be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure it's that one. She created a term. I've actually forgotten the original Chinese. You might need to help me. But the guys who go around, they're sort of something similar to the police. They go around closing hawker stalls.
Chongguan?
Yeah, I think it's the Chongguan guys.
Chongguan,
I think
like city management people?
Yeah, I believe it was them. She called them Scout Patrols with an acronym, SCOUT, and she even made up the acronym in English and told you what it spelled. And that popped up again in Chen Chihuo. And I was like, oh, so there's a Nicky Harman mythos that the Chongguans are always called the Scout Patrol. That's cool. And then maybe her acolytes will take that up and use her same vocabulary.
There's a weird thing like Howard Goldblatt has translated all sorts of writers, from like Shandong countryside writers to like Taiwanese woman writers, and it all sorts of reads the same. And he uses a lot of weird language. Like one of them I found was, he always referred to something called blue bottle flies, which
that's a British English.
Yeah, but he uses there's some phrase he uses everything, and you can find these little phrases that unite his works all across the Howard Goldblatt mythos.
I'm going to watch out for that now. That's a fun thought. And do you think other translators have picked up on that at all? Do you unconsciously? Do you think anyone?
I think so, because like you want, like when you translate something, like when you translate Jiapingwa, I would always want to sort of get close to what people had done before. So like thinking of a reader who goes to the next book, you would want them to know what Chongguan is, like to, if I worked on another book, I would think about using that Nicky Harman
Scout Patrols
invention.
Yeah. I guess there might have been other ones, but that one really stands out because it's so obviously, well, if you're thinking of it as a translation, you couldn't possibly be from Chinese, so it must be a translation. But yeah, let's not get hung up on that. Next question. So this is a callback to the episode I did with Emily Jin on the video game Wujian, which is like totally a Chinese wuxia game. It's going out of its way to give a sort of a world wandering around RPG game to, I guess, Chinese people, or at least people interested in China. But Gujian 3 has something the first two games doesn't have. It has these like, I don't know, like monsters from another dimension or something, and they're clearly a more modern sort of creation. They don't seem to have any sort of historical reference. And when we were talking about that, he said, yeah, these basically seem to be like a Lovecraftian thing, a Western sort of thing, and they've been sort of transplanted into the game, and they kind of fit and they kind of don't. But I was I was thinking about that after reading Ba Hui. And maybe this thought was put in my head by the translators, because they mentioned that what some of the only literary, never mind horror, literary heritage that goes way back into dynastic China, like where writers were writing fiction and stories for enjoyment for you to read, were the weird stories by writers like Pu Songling, strange stories. And sure enough, one of the only very old stories I've done on the show that wasn't one of the four great classic novels, Women in the Carriage, with Yulin Wang, Che Zhong Nütze. So I'm wondering actually if there is a little bit of like a weird fiction pedigree in China. I forgot to mention as well, I've learned a little bitty more about like I don't know if cosmology is the right word, but the gods and the demons that are in sort of traditional Chinese folklore mythology. And through contact with Jia Pinghua and his Lao Sheng, actually, I've learned a little bit about the Shanghai Jing, this weird bestiary that describes all these strange, like chimera-like creatures, like a horse with a man's face, or a man with a horse's face, or what have you. And I'm reading Beijing Coma right now, which has quotes or describes passages, and it describes like these gods who live in the great western wastes, they're just corpses, but they seem to be gods and are alive and something. I'm like, oh, this is really weird stuff. Like, it's maybe not Lovecraftian, but you could definitely call it weird with the big W, and you wouldn't be completely wrong. So do you think there's anything we could say there, or is it just convergent evolution of the same sort of weird feeling?
I think you could, but I think it would be somewhat specious. Like, it's interesting. This book actually, the Flock of Ba Hui, actually makes reference to Shanghai Jiang somewhere in there.
Ah,
It's like one of the books that the archaeologist was reading. There's a pair of translators, John Branscombe and Izzy Yu, who have tried to promote the idea that some of those Zhiguai stories actually have that sort of cosmic terror, cosmic horror that Lovecraft talks about. They're really interested in this writer called Ji Yun, who writes these sort of they're very short, almost like flash fiction. They call it weird nonfiction. There's like a story about like a man. There's a man walking down the street, and he has a cage, and inside is a small man, and that small man is also carrying a cage, and inside that cage is a small man, etc., etc., etc. And it's like an example of Zhiguai as cosmic horror. It's sort of like contrasted with 传奇, which are like the legends of the ancient times, and it's supposed to be like ontologically upsetting, something that gives you like some sort of creeps on a deep and cosmic level. I think it's kind of BS, but
it's like we were saying about the mud floods. It's an interesting little conceit to send your mind wandering down.
It's kind of a fun way to read them, but I don't know if they were really intended that way in the first place, but it's kind of a fun way to read it. So, I mean, no harm, no foul. They have some really interesting translations. If you Google John Branscombe and EZU, they had some translations of Ji Yun up on Samovar, which are promoting that idea of like of Ji Yun as Lovecraftian horror. If anyone wants to look at that.
I'll try to remember to put a note to that in the show links, because it interests me, so I'd like it on my post. One last thing about frameworks, given that I mentioned Mark Fisher before. So he's no longer with us. He committed suicide. But I think one of his later books before he did that was a book on the weird and the eerie, and it's pretty short. I don't think it's a masterwork or anything, but it gives you an interesting way to split up, categorize these sort of weird stories, because weird fiction is not just Lovecraft. Another sort of a root of it are the old ghost stories by writers like M.R. James, is another one I reckon, E.F. Benson. There's a slightly more modern writer who I really like called Robert Aikman, who's more in that weird ghost story sort of, I don't know, lineage than the sort of cosmic evil, horrible universe that Lovecraft writes about. And I was thinking, like, oh yeah, it would actually be helpful to have some kind of critical way to categorize them rather than just thinking about their roots. And yeah, the weird and the eerie kind of gives you that. So people, in layman's terms, what Mark Fisher says the weird is when something should not be. Either it's in the wrong place or it's a bit of a chimera. It has things that should not be together. And it can be kind of a positive thing because it imagines things that normally would not be permitted or what have you. But it should kind of be, or it can be, I think another property of the weird is it can often be disgusting. It can provoke a disgust reaction. Whereas the eerie, rather than being too many things, it's an absence. The eerie is a weird feeling of, I don't know, like, I can't remember exactly, but like maybe something that should have been there isn't there, or there's an absence that has a presence by its conspicuousness, or a feeling that you're in a world where everything that happened already happened. And the eerie can also be a sort of it's not a liberating feeling, but there's a sort of a pleasure to it. Maybe in the same way that horror and Lovecraft can have hit a sublime high. There's something nice about being in, like, I don't know, a big, eerie, frosty field just before the sun goes down or something. It's not entirely unpleasant. And I think that came into my head because your blog, you were looking at a writer who described Lovecraft as the world being a world without us. And I was thinking, oh yeah, a world without us. Sounds like it might be quite peaceful. Sounds like it might fit the category of the eerie. So before we get into the miscellaneous questions, which one of those two do you think fits these four stories best? I think it's probably the weird, things that should not be. But I could also see the eerie creeping in at other points.
Yeah, I think it's weird and eerie. You know, it's interesting you brought up that world without us. I mean, that sort of sums up what makes Lovecraft and possibly these stories so horrible, is that, you know, there's no evil forces arrayed against us. The world is, it doesn't matter. There's no good or there's no evil. It's like, I don't know, somebody compared it to like a great white shark. If you wade out into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, when you get swallowed up by a great white shark, there was no evil behind it.
It wasn't personal.
Yeah, it was just completely impersonal, and that's what makes it so horrible. Yeah.
I sometimes imagine what it would like to be an animal, because basically any animal that's not a pet and doesn't, I don't know, unless you're a bird in the area with no sparrowhawks and lots of bird feeders, it's got to stop being an animal. The world really is out to get you. You haven't got a house. In most places, it's either too hot or too cold most of the year. You constantly, even if you're a predator, you're constantly on the hunt for food, and we're only a few steps away from that. The world, I don't know. I probably have been bringing up video games on the show too much, but your health bars are always going down.
Yes.
Never goes up, and unless you're eating something else that used to be alive. on that note, let's skip to the if this book was a drink, since we're talking about consuming things. If Flock of Ba Hui was a soft, hard, or hot drink, what do you think it would be?
Well, what have I been drinking during this whole chat is Hakushu single malt Japanese whiskey and sugar-free Monster Energy drink. So I mean that
I think that's a what should not be. That's the weird.
Yeah, I mean honestly, it should be some like some fishy brew of bones and aborted fetuses. I mean, some horrible thing. But if not, then single malt Japanese whiskey and sugar-free Monster Energy drink.
I'm glad it's sugar-free. You're looking after yourself. That's good. Yeah. Cool. Does that relate to the stories, or is that just a good thing to drink when reading them?
It's just a good thing to drink, and I mean, and things that shouldn't be together. But
Yeah,
I mean, I don't have a good answer for this. I think I'll go back to the brew of how about some bone broth? How about that?
That's good.
That's a good thing to sip while reading these stories. Yeah, some strong bone broth.
Yeah, or some Qingdao from the basement underneath the brewery.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, this is one setting we didn't mention. The story set in a Han Chinese place, Qingdao, is also a place where there's some layering of time there because it's been in, I guess, dynastic Chinese hands, Republican Chinese hands, German hands, Japanese hands, Chinese communist hands. Even if I visited that brewery, and they have all those military stories of how the thing was passed back and forth. Then it was nationalized under the communists, and then it was put onto the market. So, and that really reads as a metaphor for Qingdao. So even that is a sort of a weird place in that it's not a horrible place, but it is a strange mishmash of time.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and all of these regimes were opposed to the strange, cult activity, the occult activity that was going on in the basement.
Story. Right, there you go. I wonder what that tells us. Don't know. Won't waste any more time trying to figure it out. So I skipped over what usually comes before the drink of the day, and that's the Chinese word of the day, or from character, phrase, whatever you like. Does anything jump out at you?
How about the Call of Cthulhu?
In Chinese?
Role-playing game. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
邪神呼唤. 邪神呼唤, which is like 邪神 is like evil gods. 呼唤 is the call of 邪神呼唤.
Okay.
邪神呼唤. Yeah. So if you want to play, if you want to search up the Ring of Wonder and go to the 邪神呼唤 message board, you'll find a whole new universe.
I can imagine. Yeah. Right. Last miscellaneous slot. It's your self promo slot. So you mentioned you had 2 translations in the works, but I guess those aren't available to buy yet. Is that right?
No, I mean, I'm in a sort of holding pattern where I've translated a bunch of books and just waiting for them to come out, and they should be out in 2021. You should be able to get the Jia Pinghua book by that time. I mean, hopefully, speaking of deep time, I mean, somebody will be listening to this, 100 years in the future. So if you are listening to this 100 years in the future, you've got a whole bibliography of my work to go through. But if you're listening to it a year in the future, you could find the Cai Chongda Vessel memoir, the Mai Jia book that's coming out, and especially the Jia Pinghua book that's coming out.
What is the Mai Jia book? Because there's a few other of his novels you can get in English just now.
The Mai Jia book is really incredible. It's a story about, basically starts in the 1920s, 1930s. It's a story about a guy who's alternately called the Colonel or the Eunuch. He ends up joining the KMT and becomes like a secret agent fighting against the Japanese and their collaborators, and he carries with him a horrible secret that he covers up perhaps by going along with the eunuch story. In fact, he's not a eunuch, and he quite the opposite, in fact. But I don't want to spoil the story or get into a description of why he's not a eunuch.
Okay, right. Yeah, what you said about if you're listening in the future, if it's 100 years, the listener will have found the USBs and hard drives I will have buried around the Tayside and Fife regions. The internet will be gone, of course. Civilization will have collapsed, and I'll be living with the fish people in the River Tay if I'm still alive.
A horrible vision of the future.
Right, so our last section, further reading questions. I only know of one translated Chinese horror book, and I don't really think it's in this sort of wheelhouse. So my recommendations probably would have been English language stuff. What about you? Do you have anything you could recommend, either in English or Chinese?
Yeah, there's not a lot. Around the same time I was reading this, I went back to Lu Xuan and read Diary of a Madman.
Oh yeah.
And sort of got the idea that, jettisoning any political meaning from it, it's a pretty good horror story. You know, cannibals are eating people, and this guy is aware of it. But I would say if you like this, if you can get through this, you could probably stand Arthur Merceau's Party Members. I don't like it, but probably it might be right up your alley if this appealed to you.
And it's available via the same publisher.
Yeah,
I'll recommend. Well, Mark Fisher's Weird in the Ear. It's not too hard of a read. It's interesting, and he talks about a really good Manchester band, The Fall, who all my Mancunian friends would want me to promote. But if you guys,
who is it? The Happy Mondays? What are we talking about?
It's The Fall.
The Fall. Okay.
Apparently they have a weird with a big W song or two. Yeah, a Lovecraft story I'd really recommend is The Whisper in Darkness. You should be able to read it online, I think, somewhere, but it'll be available in print too. And he's really not anything to do with anything we talked about, but anything by Robert Aickman you can read is bloody awesome.
If I got to recommend a Lovecraft story, it would be The Cats of Ultar, which is about cats killing a bunch of people. It's a very good story.
It sounds weird with a small W, not a big W.
Yeah, I mean, basically some farmers. It's about why a town has a law against killing cats. A farmer was killing cats, and a mysterious orphan arrived carrying a jet black kitten. And he catches wind of this farmer who is carrying out a cat holocaust and intervenes and sets the local strays against this farmer. They very quickly devour him and his wife, leaving a polished skeleton behind. And the local, constabulary decides we should have a law against killing cats. But read it for yourself.
Now, this is the last thing I'll end on. This might be a complete dud. Have you heard of a kid's book called Millions of Cats?
No.
Okay, I hadn't either, but I think it's an American book or something. Lovecraftian cats. Apparently, it is actually a thing. I didn't know.
Yeah, those kind of guys always like cats. You have to be an optimist to like dogs. Those kind of nihilists always like cats. If you meet a cat person, I mean, you're not going to get along with them.
Be careful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I will end the episode now that we've given some ample warning to the listener.
So we have reached the end of the show. So all that remains for me now is the plugs and then wishing you farewell. So as I said, if you'd like to get in touch, either to say lovely things or to berate me for abusing history for my own ends, then please use the social media. You can find the show on Instagram. The handle is Truchfic, TRCHFIC. On Twitter, I just use my own one, so it's @AngusLikesWords. Facebook exists, although I don't use it for much. It just sort of auto shares the episodes. What does exist and what is good and what I'm hoping to get more use out of is the show's Discord. You can talk to myself and other fans of the show. There's an invite link in the show notes, or you can just ask me for it and I will throw it your way. Now, if you'd like to support the show tangibly, which means with money, to help me cover hosting costs and all that, then there's actually several places you can do that. They're all linked to on the support page on the podcast homepage, or you can go direct to the various platforms. So probably the best one's Patreon, patreon.com/Truchfic. There's dozens and dozens of bonus episodes up there, all accessible from the minimum price, just $1 a month, more if you are a lovely person who really loves the show. You can also donate just one-off through PayPal and buy me a coffee. If you want to buy me a proverbial coffee, or more likely, to be honest, beer, then that's where you can do that. Another little thing I'd like to plug, just because it's quite cool, it's a thing I'm going to start doing, and I've done it for the Younger Strange Beasts of China episode. I'm going to make little animated versions of the YouTube uploads of the episodes, just with little spectrograms, so it'll be especially good for the interview parts because we'll have one for each guest. So if you go on YouTube and find the Younger episode, you'll see in the interview section me, Jan and Jeremy all have our own little wobbly voice waveform lines. Moving on from silly things, I'm gonna tell you the best way to spread the word about the show, and that's by actually telling people in real life. If you know anyone who's a big fan of, I don't know, Chinese things or literature or Chinese literature, then tell them about the show. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your teachers, tell your guide through the mountains of madness. And please do tell the brain that you keep in a jar beneath your bed. You know, the one that you take out at midnight when no one can see you and no one can hear what you're whispering. Please tell the brain, because I think it would, potentially be a Patreon supporter, and I really need those brain dollars. But anyway, until you tune in again, 再见。
再见，杰克，再见我。